This is our program for the week of December 6th, 2024. In our first several PSAs, we often cited, referenced, or referred to the reports from doctors on the ground in Gaza, including Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan, a pediatric intensive care doctor with MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians. She's been a consistent voice for morality in the midst of the genocide, not only working on the ground to treat patients, but also speaking publicly to the international community about the need for intervention and true solidarity with the Palestinian people. A week ago, she testified again before the UN Palestinian Rights Committee. The whole testimony is worth a listen, and we'll drop it in the chat, but I want to play her comments, her final comments from that day right now.
I'm speaking to you today both as a member of civil society and as a healthcare worker who has witnessed firsthand the death and destruction inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We spent the last 14 months watching as the most live-streamed and documented genocide in history has been met with silence, widespread propaganda campaigns justifying the unjustifiable, silencing and discrediting those who have attempted to expose it. The eyewitnesses that have made it out alive consistently reported crimes that in any other context would have led to sanctions. But here, after 14 months of the most grave breaches of humanitarian law, gross violations of human rights, barbaric war crimes, it is met with impotence by individuals, countries, and the very institution represented by this building. One day, someone will dig up the records of our testimonies, pleading for 14 months. They will dig up the records of Palestinians covering their own genocide when international journalists were unprecedentedly banned from entering. Palestinian children setting up press conferences to tell the world that their lives mattered. We will have to reckon with that history. The precedent that's been set in Gaza, as some of my colleagues here have mentioned earlier, it's going to spread everywhere throughout the world. It signals the demise of rule of law. We've already seen it spread to Lebanon. And as one volunteer surgeon said, when I was in Gaza, I felt like it was a prelude to the end of humanity. If solidarity with your fellow humans is not enough of a reason to act, think about how this is going to spill over. This should be frightening for everyone. I recognize that the words I shared with you today are heavy. But these words pale in comparison to the reality experienced by Palestinians for over 400 days and 76 years before that. Palestinians don't need our pity. They don't need our praise. They need our meaningful and truthful solidarity. And there is no time for despair. In the 24 hours that I'm going to spend in this city, at least 60 children in Gaza will be injured or killed. I recognize that many of you here, by virtue of being here today, are already convinced of the need to act. It takes courage to fight a corrupted system, a system that gives disproportionate to countries with terrible records of global violence. Today, as all of us sit here in the comfort of safety, Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya is in Kamal Adwan Hospital, just discharged from the intensive care unit after he was injured by an Israeli strike. His son was killed not long ago. His two daughters are injured. And yet he continues steadfastly to provide care for his patients. He said a few days ago, we will continue to provide this service at any cost to ourselves. The courage and action by Palestinian healthcare workers in the face of this genocide presents an exemplary model for all of us. The question I want to last leave you with is, what are we risking?
What are we risking? Over the last few weeks, we've been licking our wounds from the election, preparing and steeling ourselves for the fight before us against an emboldened Trump regime that has promised to enact a slate of authoritarian and draconian policies that have a through line of repression and ethnic cleansing. Quote, "It's going to spread everywhere throughout the world," Dr. Haj Hassan said. "It signals the end of the rule of law," she quoted a colleague who has seen the world's failure to act for Gaza as a, quote, "prelude to the end of humanity." Dr. Haj Hassan implored UN officials and all of us to think about our self-interest in avoiding that outcome if we are not already interested in being in solidarity with fellow human beings suffering at the extreme. Gaza, like the Sudan and Congolese crises, is important for Gaza's sake, of course, but for all humanity because it has shattered the illusion of human decency in capitalist society and resurfaced the festering wounds of colonialism and imperialism. These are lethal for a sustainable, ethical planet. If we are indeed standing on a precipice, then the genocide in Gaza and those who have authored it will likely be remembered as the final tumbling stone that brings a rockslide of declining norms of decency, with more violence and inhumanity perpetrated by the empowered and armed. That's why it's so important to not forget about Gaza right now and moving forward, because they have made clear that part of their authoritarian program is to target Palestinian solidarity work, because the long history of anti-terrorism has been used to crush working class people's movements for liberation historically. Because the earliest mention of terrorism in a federal statute in 1969 dealt specifically with restricting humanitarian aid to Palestinians and inaugurated a pattern of rendering Palestinians as synonymous with terrorism. The fight to end the genocide in Gaza is at the core of the fight against fascism, authoritarianism, neoliberalism, and all the tendencies that dehumanize human beings and make it impossible for any struggles to prevail. What are we risking? Dr. Haj Hassan said. Well, one way to understand that question is by looking at Palestinians themselves, especially those in Gaza. Today marks a year since the assassination of Palestinian poet and author Rifat al-Arir, and I want to leave you with some of his last defiant and yes, haunting words about what's on the line for all of us in the fight to end the genocide in Gaza.
We know that it's very bleak, it's very dark. There's no way out. If there's no water, there is no way out of Gaza. What should we do? Like drown? Like commit mass suicide? Is this what Israel wants? And we're not going to do that. And I was telling some friend the other day that I am an academic. Probably the toughest thing I have at home is an expo marker. But if the Israelis invade, if they charge at us, open door to door to massacre us, I'm going to use that marker, throw it at the Israeli soldiers, even if that is the last thing that I would be able to do. And this is the feeling of everybody. We are helpless. We have nothing to lose.
Samar, welcome back to the Friday PSAs. We're happy to have you join us. This is a year since Rafat al-Arir's, assassination. This past week, we've seen just more news coming out about all that's going on the ground. But I think amidst all of the news about cabinet picks and other world news, it's not it's difficult to imagine that this has been at the forefront of everyone's minds like it was over the past year. And I think I'm certainly concerned. I think you're concerned, and many of us are concerned about keeping Gaza top of mind. Just wondering how you've seen the last couple of weeks play out, and before we get into your PSA, analysis, just some of your reflections on how you think Gaza is being discussed at this moment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks, Thomas. It's always great to be back here. I think you're right. I think in a lot of ways, and for a lot of reasons, it sometimes feels like Gaza is receding a little bit into the background, right? Both in terms of what's happening regionally with sort of escalations in Syria, with the ongoing violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon, but also domestically, right? As people start thinking about Trump and all of this stuff, I think there's a real pressure on people to start, like prioritizing other things, and there's a real danger in that, right? And I find myself sometimes having to check myself and make sure that I'm continuing to center Gaza in all of my work and in my thinking, because that's part of the plan, right? The plan for this genocide is to get people to stop paying attention. They've been trying to do that for over a year now. And in many ways it works, right? The people's attention spans is low. And so continuing to center Gaza not only I feel like is important as the sort of duty we owe to the people experiencing this genocidal violence, but also because in so many ways Gaza continues to be at the center of a lot of what is happening, right? And these questions of Palestine permeate all these other questions around what's happening regionally and what's happening with the right-wing authoritarian takeover in the United States and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's hard to keep those things in your head at the same time. But I don't know. I think it's incumbent on all of us to continue to do that and to make sure that the people around us are doing that too.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, those connections are there. They just need to be
Yeah.
sort of emphasized, right? Like the connections between and the integral nature of the fight for Gaza and the fight against fascism and authoritarianism. I know there's a lot to catch up on. I know also there's yeah, a lot that may have happened this week that folks didn't catch up on. So we're looking forward to your updates and appreciate you being here. Hand it over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I'm not sure that I caught up on everything that happened this week, including some of the stuff that happened last week that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So please forgive me if I skip anything, and let me know in the Q&As. So the death toll from the past 2 weeks was quite high across the region. As sort of expected, the level of violence continues to escalate. Just in these past few months, I think the official toll in Gaza went up by another 700 or so, and in Lebanon by a few hundred, bringing the total now just under 4,000, but likely much higher than that, of course. Um, and a lot has been happening in Gaza, even though there's been very little coverage of it. So, like, digging out the stories in Gaza has been more difficult than it has been previously, but that doesn't mean that fewer things are happening. It just means that the media's attention tends to be elsewhere. So doing our usual, starting in Rafah and working our way up through the Gaza Strip. Uh, a few things happening here that are important. The most important of which is that the main crossing in Gaza, which is the Kerem Shalom crossing in Rafah, is basically, for all intents and purposes, shut down at this point. So UNRWA, among other agencies, has now stopped moving things through it. And we'll come back to that. We'll talk a little bit about the aid situation in a minute, but just to say that the reopening of those crossings is a really critical juncture right now, and one that's sort of being discussed by different groups, including, incidentally, Hamas and Fatah, who have new plans around some of the southern border crossings in their like post-war administration plans. But I did not include that. If more things develop there, we could talk about it next week. Meanwhile, I think the fighting in Rafah continues to be quite pitched, despite the fact that the IDF has now been claiming that it's been all over for quite some time. But what we're seeing is increasingly sophisticated Hamas attacks onto Israeli troops, like these attacks that require long-term coordination communication, which is specifically the things that Israel says it's dismantled in Rafah. So just once again goes to show that this sort of like permanent occupation structure doesn't seem to be working. Moving up to Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah, a series of strikes on on a hospital and the humanitarian zone in al-Mawasi that killed 48 Palestinians in that one strike, but across the Gaza Strip even more in just that one day, including a armed ground offensive where tanks and troops have moved into Khan Yunis again, basically throughout the area in a way that they hadn't for a little while. And so this sort of ongoing troop deployments was supposedly the thing that was meant to stop, as Israel tries to, quote unquote, wind down the situation in Gaza. Just shows that, like, yeah, again, they're not able to really do that in any meaningful way. But of course, the big news in Gaza continues to be the general's plan of ethnic cleansing in the north. A lot is happening there, and none of it is good. A series of Israeli strikes, again, very clearly designed to destroy the ability to sustain life in northern Gaza, including yet another attack on yet another hospital, not the same Kamal Adwan attacks that we've been seeing for the past few weeks, but now the setting fire to the Indonesian hospital in Beit Lahia. And in addition to that, the assassination of Mahmoud al-Madhoun, who was one of the co-founders of the Gaza Soup Kitchen, which has been feeding 3,000 people per day, mostly in northern Gaza. And so these like really, clear attempts to destroy the underlying infrastructure that still sustains anyone who's still able to stay in the north. And the reasoning behind this, is becoming clearer by the day. Not that we needed more evidence of it, but the plan of basically purging all of northern Gaza of any remaining Palestinians is really moving forward at a terrifying pace. And a wild news story that came out in Dropsite this week showed how the Israeli housing minister, along with some settlement activists, are basically scouring resettlement sites. So, like trying to find places in northern Gaza and in Beit Lahia in particular for new Israeli settlements. The ministers describe it specifically as the state's answer to the ICC warrants, basically saying like, oh, the ICC wants to issue arrest warrants for our prime minister, so in response to that, we're going to settle Gaza. And in addition to this like sort of settlement plan that seems to be gaining steam, the other discovery from this Dropsite article is that construction companies in Israel that specialize in settlement construction, so the ones that have built all of the illegal settlements across the West Bank, are now operating inside northern Gaza. They're not building anything, they're just tearing things down. And so whether they're just contracted to help with the demolitions, or they're also going to be there to do some other stuff is not entirely clear yet. But the fact that they're there, I think, is a very telltale sign. The other like little bit about this is that, you know, the former defense minister of Israel, Moshe Yaalon, is now calling what's happening in northern Gaza ethnic cleansing, which like I think tells you a lot from a, you know, hawkish Zionist. Just the will, you know, the inability to hide the fact that it is very, very clearly that, while, you know, the U.S. continues to sort of refuse to acknowledge that that's what's happening. Across Gaza, like one article that I just wanted to mention for folks because I was really struck by it was this Washington Post piece that just goes through a series of Israeli soldiers, you know, TikTok and Instagram videos in Gaza for the past year. It is not easy watching, as you can imagine, so I don't recommend it unless you feel ready for it. But it's really shocking. And quite overwhelming to see, frankly. Particularly when you know, I was watching some of these videos and I was reflecting on the crisis that was caused by like a couple of these videos being leaked in Iraq when, you know, the United States was in Abu Ghraib, and what an international crisis that created, and how far we've fallen even from that time where like not only are these not being leaked, they're being like published directly by Israeli soldiers with basically no consequences whatsoever. And it's just, yeah, it's absurd to see and like so clear of like of the genocidal intent that's underpinning a lot of that. So a hard thing to watch, but I think an important one to see. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, another series of attacks on hospitals. You know, we're seeing this as a sort of a kind of broad systematic targeting, both in Gaza and across the West Bank. And so this is in addition to the sort of ongoing siege of Jenin that we talk about every now and again. But under the pretext of like assassinating terrorists, the IDF continues to storm into hospitals and shoot patients. So nothing new there, but a sort of continued attempt to consolidate control over the West Bank in ways that often feel like a prelude to this annexation story that seems to be gaining traction with the you know, upcoming Trump presidency. And in the context of that, this legislation introduced by Tom Cotton this week, the Republican senator from Arkansas, to the most like Orwellian doublespeak legislation I have ever seen, and I think that's saying a lot. That the name of the legislation is retiring the egregious confusion over the genuine name of Israel's zone of influence by necessitating government use of Judea and Samaria. And that was an acronym, if you didn't catch that. It's recognizing Judea and Samaria, and basically saying that the US should stop using the politically charged term West Bank to refer to the biblical heartland of Israel. So again, no real question here about Republican plans as it relates to what's going to happen in the West Bank in the coming years. The aid situation overall, you know, just to say is like, it's hard to get a real sense of how things are looking right now, but reasonable to assume that this is near the worst it's ever been or at the worst it's ever been, again, despite the so-called U.S. ultimatums to force Israel to increase aid shipments into Gaza. So UNRWA and a couple of other agencies have now basically said that they will no longer use the Kerem Shalom crossing, as I mentioned earlier. It's worth noting that that crossing is, I think, the only one that is actually designed for cargo shipments. And over the course of the past year has been responsible for at least two-thirds, if not significantly more, of all aid that's been going into Gaza. And so the fact that that area has now been rendered largely inoperable because of the security situation that Israel is creating in that region around the border crossing is going to have really devastating consequences. And obviously, the blame of these UN agencies is put squarely on Israel, saying that Israel has created a security situation that makes it impossible for us to operate. This is after, we talked a couple weeks ago about how 100 aid trucks were looted with the sort of tacit support of Israeli forces inside Gaza. So this is sort of an ongoing and continuing thing. In response, partly to that, but also something that's been in the works for a little while, is this UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act, which was put forward by Peter Welch, but supported by the same group of senators that backed the Bernie Sanders joint resolutions of disapproval that we talked about a few weeks ago. And just as a note of how like even legislation that fails sort of starts to build an institutional momentum, it's important to see like how these bills are actually important and moving things along. I don't think it's very likely to pass, but the fact that the Biden administration is being pushed on this basically bill to resume funding to UNRWA. If folks remember, the U.S. government basically blocked all funding to UNRWA as part of the budget negotiation deals that the Dems and the Republicans had a few months ago. So basically saying like actually UNRWA is critical to the operations of aid distribution in Palestine, and the U.S. has a responsibility to fund it. So it's good that that's at least getting out there, and the record is being set straight about the nonsense charges that Israel was levying against UNRWA and its employees. Every week, I feel like I talk about how I'm not going to say anything about Gaza ceasefires anymore. And then every week, there's more to say about the ceasefire in Gaza that never happens. And apparently, there is now a new push for a new potential ceasefire. I wouldn't hold my breath, but again, you never know. This time, what seems to be happening is that Trump, in preparation for taking office, has been pressuring his Israeli counterparts to make a deal. Trump is really keen on making deals. And so there is a commitment by the Israelis to they said that they would try to get a ceasefire signed before he comes into office. And he's been saying very publicly, I want it done before January 20th. And the Israelis, longtime friends of Trump are at least performing the act of trying to make that happen. So this ceasefire doesn't look very different than the one that was being floated around back in August. It's being managed by Egypt a little bit more these days because Qatar has pulled out as a mediator for reasons that were discussed in our last session, if you want to go back and look at those. The only changes here are pretty cosmetic, frankly. I think the August ceasefire had called for a 42-day temporary cessation of hostilities. The new one calls for a 42 to 60-day. So it doesn't even actually extend it. It just extends the possibility of extending it. And then, is a little bit looser in how many people are covered in the hostage exchange. So, women and men over 50 that are still being held in Gaza are supposed to be released, but there used to be a specific number, and that sort of got massaged out. Hamas hasn't said anything about this, and I don't think that they were even apprised of this new ceasefire by the time these articles came out. So we'll see whether or not they have anything to say about it. But at the bare minimum, it seems like what Israel is trying to do here is to say to Trump, look, we tried, we're doing another round of the ceasefire stuff like you asked, but I wouldn't hold out a ton of hope that this really changes things. But with the changes regionally, it's really hard to say how Hamas is reading those changes and what they want to do with all of that. So who knows? And around that time, Trump also put out this bananas post on Truth Social, basically about, like, oh, everyone seems to care about the hostages, but I'm the one that's going to make sure that there's going to be hell to pay unless the hostages get released. And I think this is his attempt to move the deal forward in his typical ham-fisted way. So no real movement there, but once again, more talk about ceasefires that seems to be going nowhere. Speaking of ceasefires that are in fact going nowhere, the ceasefire in Lebanon was signed last week, I think. Um, it was delayed because of the ICC arrest warrants, which caused a whole set of problems, and we'll get into some of it. But just to say that, obviously it freaked Israel out, and then there were some issues around France and its enforcement of them. But broadly, I think a lot of folks saw this ceasefire getting signed, this 60-day truce, right? That requires uh, Hezbollah forces to move north of the Litani River and Israeli forces to completely evacuate Lebanon and to respect Lebanese territorial integrity. The last time we talked on the PSAs, we mentioned that the sticking point in the ceasefire negotiations was this like question of Israel respecting Lebanon's sovereignty, right? The Israel's unwillingness to let go of the idea that it wanted to be able to bomb and assassinate people in Lebanon whenever it wanted. But, that being a sort of non-starter for Hezbollah and the Lebanese state generally, frankly. Um, the way that they got around that was that no, like it was included in the ceasefire negotiations that Israel would respect Lebanon's territorial integrity. And then there was a separate letter that nobody has seen but does exist, saying that the US backed Israel's right to defend itself in Lebanon. And we all know what Israel defending itself means. So that is, I think, the thing that sort of unlocked the ceasefire and allowed it to be signed. Although, from the very beginning, people were saying that it was going to be a very tenuous ceasefire. And sure enough, it is already being violated massively. You know, um, I imagine that folks listening can guess who is doing the violating of the ceasefire and to what extent. And you won't be surprised to hear that, like, Israel, I think, has already violated the terms of the ceasefire more than 100 times in just the past week. And so, like, a series of bombardments, continued troop presence inside Lebanon, more assassinations, and, Hezbollah now firing back after multiple days of Israel violating the ceasefire before Hezbollah had a military response, I believe. And now there's a sort of tit for tat that's going on. So it's unclear whether the ceasefire will hold, to the extent that, hold implies that it ever really was enacted, and it really wasn't, frankly. So it's possible that the whole thing's going to fall apart. It's worth noting that even the United States is saying that Israel is the one violating the ceasefire, which is pretty rare and I think speaks to the egregiousness of those violations. Um, uh, but the concern here is that Israel has stated very publicly that if the ceasefire officially gets like ended, if they stop trying to enforce it, that it will not only sort of resume its old operations, but it will now consider the Lebanese state as a whole to be a sort of like enemy combatant, like enemy in the war. So, up to this point, Israel has said our wars with Hezbollah, they have hit Lebanese military targets, but they always claim it's a mistake and they haven't done it very much. This would sort of change the calculus overall, but there isn't much there because it's not like the Lebanese military does much one way or another, but um, it does imply Israel's willingness to escalate the conflict even further from where it is right now. So we still don't have this side letter that the U.S. sent to Israel that confirms their right to defend themselves in Lebanon. There's some really Orwellian denials of it, or like your refusal to engage with it with the State Department, including this exchange with Matt Miller that I've posted here. But what we do have is the full text of the ceasefire agreement itself between Israel and Lebanon. So if folks want to read that, you can catch it on the Middle East Eye website. It's quite short. Um, we can frankly do an entire PSA just on the Lebanon ceasefire. I feel like it's really hard to do it justice. There's a lot here, and I think there are a lot of big questions around why the ceasefire was signed now and who sort of came out on top, and whether um, what role the different actors had in this and how they'll sort of move forward. So maybe it might be worth spending a session on this or bringing in more people to talk about it sometime in the future. I think I'll just say that my quick take on this is that this wasn't really an outcome where anybody won. This wasn't, it was a situation where I think all parties were sort of forced into this arrangement in a way that none of them would have ideally wanted. It's clear that it seems to me at least that the IDF didn't really get what it wanted to get in Lebanon, which was demonstrating, a sort of qualitative military superiority over Hezbollah to sort of regain regain its pride after being shellacked so horribly in 2006. And that clearly didn't happen, right? Like the IDF really, really struggled to hold any sort of territory in Lebanon, despite having overwhelming military power. So I think in that way, it was a strong showing for Hezbollah, but also like the fact that Hezbollah had to sort of cave on the idea of that joint front, this like, oh, we won't ever have a ceasefire until there's a ceasefire in Gaza, has of course fallen off. Um, and that I think is a sign that, that Hezbollah wasn't able to control the narrative or to control the situation on the ground sufficiently to be able to hold that position, right? Seeing that a ceasefire in Gaza basically is never going to happen. So at some point, right, the fighting had to end. There's a lot more to say about that, but maybe we'll save it for another time. But if folks have questions, feel free to ask them. Wanted to touch quickly on some ICC stuff, particularly around France's role in the Lebanon ceasefire. It and the US are the two countries that are guaranteeing the ceasefire. And one of the conditions that the US put on France for being part of those processes was that it had to walk back its previous commitment to arrest Netanyahu. And so there's apparently this whole back and forth where they finally agreed on some language that just opened the door to the possibility that France wouldn't arrest Netanyahu. So, like they put out this statement saying that it's possible that Netanyahu could be covered by some immunities, depending on the interpretation of the courts. So it actually doesn't meaningfully change whether or not France is likely to arrest Netanyahu. And I think they actually, based on the statements of their government officials, it sounds like they feel like they would have to. But what they did concede to is basically muddying the waters, right? And opening the door for other countries to sort of push back on these ICC requirements, despite the fact that all signatories to the ICC are required to arrest Netanyahu if he lands in their countries. This was particularly egregious in the Netherlands, where, not only being the headquarters of the ICC, the prime minister put out some really mealy statements, basically saying there may be conditions where Netanyahu could visit the Netherlands and not have to be arrested, and was asked to elaborate on what those conditions would be and refused to elaborate. And he said, like the Dutch government will be in full cooperation with the ICC. So like, these are sort of like nonsense statements, sort of designed to shore up a little bit of Zionist support, but it's a really um, frustrating show of like the willingness to sort of waffle on these, ostensible, meaningful commitments that these countries make to the international order, such that it even exists. Of course, the ICC is responding to this, right? And to the threats that it's facing from the United States, along with the threats it's facing from Russia around some of the Ukraine stuff. So it's funny that it's being hit from both sides at this point. But the other big international news, I suppose, is another UN General Assembly vote that pushed for a Palestinian state and called for Israel to end its unlawful occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There's been a few of these now, and they're just UN General Assembly votes that don't necessarily cause any sort of like immediate material effect. But I think the thing that's worth noting here is how the votes are shifting over time, particularly like which countries have historically voted in a pro-Israel way and are now moving out of that position. And this vote, I think, was 157 to 8. So only 8 countries voted against it, and then I think another 8 abstentions or something like that. And the 8 countries that voted against it are your usual suspects, right? United States, Israel, Argentina, and then the few Pacific Island countries that the United States controls at the UN, and that's it. So like all the Western European countries, Australia, Canada, um, who have historically voted against or abstained are actually now voting for it, which is a pretty big development, frankly. Um, the other news that came out this week that I think is quite noteworthy, of course, is the Amnesty International report that concludes that Israel is in fact committing a genocide in Gaza. It's a devastating report. I really recommend people give it a read. It's just shy of 300 pages, meticulously researched, very drawn out, and very thoughtful. It's hard to read, of course, but it is very powerful. And, this is yet another, I think, indication of how the conclusion of genocide becomes inescapable, right? And this leaves people, particularly within the liberal order, of either rejecting sort of like you know, core institution of human rights in the Western world, Amnesty International, um, or accepting the fact that they are in fact committing genocide. So, you're seeing a lot of people like attack Amnesty International right now as an attempt to undermine this report, even though those same people, were speaking very highly of Amnesty International reports very recently. So it just kind of once again highlights that hypocrisy. And holding people to that, I think, is a valuable advocacy tool here. And I think this is a really important asset for us in the push for an arms embargo, right? Where this report holds very clearly, and Amnesty says very plainly, uh, it's incumbent on every government now in the world to make sure that there is an arms embargo because they are otherwise complicit in genocide. And that's going to be a thing that I think a lot of people don't want sort of hanging over their heads. So I do think there will be implications of this report, even if they're a little bit long term and a bit abstract. The response to the report has been fascinating. The extent to which the attack on it has been coordinated is really wild. You can see here these like 5 tweets that all use the exact same screenshot, right? Like these are large accounts with really big followings that are all basically getting the exact same talking points and using the exact same talking points. How I wish we were anywhere near this level of coordinated compared to the genocide supporters. But the attacks on the report actually started like days before the report even came out. So if you Googled Amnesty's genocide report yesterday, before it was released, sorry, Wednesday, before it was released, the only articles you would find are from like right-wing media outlets attacking the credibility of Amnesty International. And like cherry picking little sentences, despite the fact that, again, they used like a really methodical, very comprehensive, very legalistic approach here that really stands up to any of that kind of scrutiny. So read it, share it. I mean, you don't have to read the whole 300-page report, but make sure your elected officials at least know that it exists. The last little bit on Palestine that I wanted to share is our departing lovely president, Joe Biden, being caught apparently buying the Rashid Khaldi book, 100 Years War on Palestine, and in the like basically same breath, using some of his last remaining power to uh, prevent a environmental justice organization from receiving federal funding because of its support for Palestine. So yeah, that attack on the CJA is really critically important. I think it sets a really, really dangerous precedent for how organizations who speak up for Palestine could be attacked, and making sure that organizations feel like they can do that without risking their own operations. Otherwise, we risk people sort of feeling like talking about Palestine is too big of a risk for them to do. And we want to make sure that that does not happen. So whatever we can do to shore up support for the Climate Justice Alliance, please do. There is a petition that I will share shortly that you all can sign, among other things to do there. So lastly, and just to close it out nice and easy, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Syria. You would think I would be thrilled to talk about this because this is actually my area of professional expertise. You know, I worked professionally on Syria stuff for a very long time. You know, my like master's thesis is on the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. I lived on the Syrian border in Turkey doing humanitarian coordination for many years of this war. I was in DC doing like government relations and like saw some of the attempts of the DC establishment to build up the Syrian opposition, and I continue to do like research and analysis on Syria. So you would think I'd be very happy to talk about it, but I'm really not. It's not an easy thing to talk about. Syria is very complicated. It's very messy. I think there's a lot of different pieces here and a lot of different ways that a single piece of information sort of cuts. People have very strong feelings, and a lot of them are very valid, even when they come from very different places. Um, so you know, I just want to say like my quick take on this. I don't have a really strong position one way or another. I feel like it's a mess, and I have to just sit in that mess. Um, and you know, for me, I think like life in Syria has been a struggle for a long time now for a lot of people, and they suffer from the fact that there are no great actors for them on the national stage, right? Like none of these people that we're talking about are, I think, doing a wonderful job. Mm, but what I thought would be useful, again, we could do an entire PSA on Syria if that could be useful for folks. But what I thought would be useful today was just maybe go over a little bit of who the main actors are and what their relevance is, and a quick explanation of what happened, you know, this past week and how it relates to what's happening in Palestine. So, you know, this map that incredibly is already out of date, even though I posted it here yesterday, shows, I think, the main five-ish forces. There's, I don't know, maybe seven-ish entities that you would need to know in Syria that, you know, control different parts of it. Um, these are all really complicated entities with a lot going on here. It's actually a great opportunity for me to do a shameless plug and say, if you want to know more about what different areas of Syria are looking like right now and how they're sort of operating, you can. It's on my desk. You can read my chapter in the book Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa. It's a page turner. Really exciting stuff. I wrote it a few years ago, so it's a little bit out of date, but you know, it does go into a lot of the main actors that we're talking about today. And so maybe just to go through this map quickly, um, you know, the red area here, of course, is like the Syrian government forces, along with some Hezbollah folks and Russian government support. So, you know, those three and some Iranian support are all working sort of together under the banner of the Syrian government. Not much to say there other than like, yeah, that's the existing old state of Syria. The yellow area up here, you know, bordering Turkey and Iraq, is the Syrian Democratic Forces, a nice name for what is largely a Kurdish-controlled autonomous region now that sometimes cooperates with the government and sometimes doesn't. That's largely run by the YPG, which is like the Kurdish main armed group that operates inside Syria, with direct links to the like Kurdish like People's Party in Turkey. And so a big reason that Turkey feels a very strong inclination to be involved in Syria is its fear about what's happening with this Kurdish autonomous zone and its desire to not have anything like it happen in Turkey. Um, and so Turkey, being very involved in this, is sort of controlling these teal areas in the north here, which is the Syrian National Army, not to be confused with the Syrian Arab Army, which is the Syrian government's army. Also, you know, like when people talk about the Free Syrian Army, they're often talking about the Syrian National Army. Those are broadly the same thing. And these are Turkish supported areas that like the Turkish government plays a very big role in. And then the other big actor up here, of course, in the green is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, often just called HTS, which is the organization that is largely responsible for this big offensive that we're seeing right now. Although the Syrian National Army is also involved a little bit. Um, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the new name of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the former big militia group that was operating in Syria that was the Al-Qaeda branch uh, of Syria, like the Al-Qaeda like militant branch in Syria. Um, the break from Al-Qaeda is a real one. I think people often think that they just like, slapped a coat of paint on top of what they were doing before and like they're still Al-Qaeda but in disguise. But that's actually not, I think that's not actually true. Like there does seem to be a real genuine break there to the extent that there was some pretty heavy fighting between the folks who stayed loyal to Al Qaeda and the folks who didn't. But how close they continue to ideologically align with that sort of right wing like Muslim fundamentalist sort of take is somewhat of an open question, although it's definitely there. Um, the last little bits that are too complicated to really get into, but just to say that down here in Der'a, um, there is also a sort of opposition thing happening, particularly now. There's been a really big increase in opposition activity there, but um, previous to that, the opposition had been sort of co-opted by the government and they were sort of working together. And then, of course, the US controls this little chunk here by Iraq and Jordan in Tenf, where there's an Air Force base that the US controls, along with another part of the Free Syrian Army. So that's all the different actors, largely. I guess the other person to mention here is Hamas, which used to be headquartered in Damascus, but took the opposite side of Hezbollah in this conflict. So Hezbollah sided with Iran and the Syrian government, Hamas not so much. And so this was like, just to say, like, none of these groups are a monolith, right? There's a lot of different pieces here operating in different ways. So um, what happened is that this group here, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, with some backing from these Turkish-backed forces. So like it's clear that Turkey at least knew about this offensive, although it's not super clear how keen they were on it. Launched this massive offensive that took over Aleppo in a day. They've now taken Hama and are basically, I think, as of today, looking like they might take Homs, which is the last big city on the way to Damascus, although Homs to Damascus is a very long way. Um, so there's this like sort of massive rebel advance inside Syria uh, that a lot of people feel like was suspiciously timed to the extent that like literally the day after the ceasefire was signed in Lebanon was the day that this offensive sort of popped off. A lot of people said that something was going to happen in Syria after that. I think there are a few different ways to interpret that are not all limited to the idea that this is like a big Israeli op or like a US-backed plan, which is not to say that it isn't, but that there are other ways of seeing it that I think are equally valid. At the bare minimum, I think it's clear that these Syrian opposition forces at least didn't want to be perceived as, uh, undermining the fight against Israel, right? There's a reason that they, unfurled a gigantic banner on the castle in Aleppo, uh, right after taking control of the city, right? To show like, oh no, 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 we're not actually like supporting Israel in this. And so to do it while Hezbollah and other forces were occupied with Israel, I think would have been a bad like PR look for them. Um, how they feel about it is a little bit more complicated. I mean, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has said very openly that they have no plans to interfere with Israel in any way. Like their only fight is inside Syria. So obviously, I think that is something that is amenable to the Israelis on some level, although like how much they want Al Qaeda, well, not Al Qaeda, but how much they want an organization that, you know, echoes Al Qaeda to have control of Syria is a little bit unclear. They obviously don't love the Syrian government, which is like a stated enemy of the Israeli state. The main thing I think that Israel and the US want here is to cut off the arms transfer corridor, right? This really critical corridor between Iran and Lebanon, where Syria is the main way that Hezbollah and Iran associated resistance groups get their weapons. And so the most important thing for Israel is cutting off that supply line, no question. I think that's much more important to them than the Syrian state itself, which the Syria has not been attacking Israel in this past year, right? Like the front on the Golan Heights, which is occupied Syrian territory, has actually been quite quiet. Um, so just to say that, there's a complicated set of differing incentives here. And among them, I think, particularly among Turkey and other Western states that, may seem to be keen to see a post-Assad Syria, also are very, very keen, much more keen than they are to see a post-Assad Syria, is to not see an increase of refugee outflows, right? I think the thing that Turkey wants most of all, and particularly also European states, is to not have more Syrian refugees. So I think what they want is stability. And I think there's a real fear that these rebels, as they advance, might create instability. So it's hard to peg exactly how much support these groups have and what it's going to mean, particularly as they move from these northern areas into southern Syria where Damascus is and stuff, where again the Syria has an air force, Russia continues to back them, and Hezbollah has apparently, as of today, moved at least 100 or so troops back into Syria to support the government. So it's going to be messy. All we know for sure is it's going to be really, really, really messy. Um, it will undoubtedly impact Hezbollah's ability to operate um, inside Lebanon as it, continues to fight, given that the ceasefire never really took hold, and its ability to continue its weapons flows. Um, how it impacts the situation in Gaza and the West Bank is a little bit more complicated and a bit more of a wait and see. Um, but I think we'll know a lot more in the coming week. We'll probably have some big updates next Friday. And so there's a lot more to say about this, but yeah, it's hard to know. And maybe the last thing I should note is the other actor that I didn't mention here in these little dark pockets inside the government-controlled area are ISIS, which continues to operate inside Syria, right? That has never fully gone away. Um, and so, I'm sure, seeing a strategic opportunity here. We might see some changes on that front as well, including, by the way, the Kurdish area has also grown significantly just in the last day. There's some big advances there as well. So everything changing all at once. A big push also of the opposition from Daraa up to Damascus. So some changes happening in that direction too. So will the Syrian government survive all this? Don't know. Honestly, don't know. If you had asked me a day ago, I would have said probably yes. But today I'm feeling a little less confident in that assertion. What will it mean for how Syria, will it devolve into a Libya situation? Possibly. Um, will the rebels get turned around because they're stretching themselves too thin? Also very possible. Um, so I don't know. What we're seeing is, a region where Russia's bogged down by Ukraine, Iran, and Hezbollah are, both sort of dealing with the aftermath of this ongoing fight with Israel. Um, and so, it was a strategic moment, I think, for the Syrian opposition to move. And so they did. And so, uh, yeah, I think it will complicate things without a doubt. It will be a liability for Hezbollah without a doubt. Beyond that, I don't know that we know much about how this is going to impact the dynamics on the ground. Although if people have good analysis on this, please let me know. I put together this extremely simple chart that is probably not going to be useful to anybody, outlining who I think the main actors here are, what they want, but what they're constrained by. I didn't even include the Syrian opposition on this chart, and I probably should have. So if that's useful to you all, please do check it out. A couple small things to wrap up. I wanted to note that this study in The Nation about the media's coverage of Gaza, I think, was really fascinating. The ways that certain language is used when they talk about Israel or when they talk about Ukraine versus when they talk about Palestinians. And so I wanted to highlight some really big BDS victories from last week, including Puma stopping its sponsorship of the Israeli Football Association after a lot of pressure from us, and Sabra, incredibly, divesting like the Israeli company that makes Sabra divesting its shares entirely. So now Sabra is only owned by Pepsi, which means the only reason to continue to boycott Sabra is that it's gross and not that it's Israeli owned. And so summing up, regional international circumstances are changing pretty rapidly, and those are going to have really big impacts on the ground, although we won't necessarily know what they are. The ceasefire in Lebanon seems to be on the verge of collapse, but maybe there was never really a plan to implement that ceasefire meaningfully before Trump takes office. The situation in Syria really massively complicates everything, and it will for some time, no matter what. There's no clean way out of this for the next few months. There's a lot to say here about like what our role is and how we can engage with Syria and shouldn't engage with Syria, and maybe we'll save that for a future session. And then, yeah, just to say the Amnesty report on genocide is kind of a big deal, and it's important for us to force people to reckon with it. Some upcoming actions that I want to flag. As I mentioned earlier, the Climate Justice Alliance really needs people to support them right now. So I'd please send this letter to the EPA demanding that their funds be released. Our friends at Nodutol are doing some really amazing work pushing back against that attempted right-wing authoritarian takeover in Korea. So if folks can take a moment to sign their petition, I think that would be great. We need to maintain our global intersectionality. There's a third petition from JVP that I wanted to add and I didn't, but maybe I'll drop it in the chat shortly. Would be great if folks can sign that too about some of the, the nonprofit killer bill and some of that Anti-Semitism Awareness Act stuff that we've talked about previously. And if you want to if you want to show up to any of the events that are happening, please check out the AROC calendar. Text PSA to 833-633-0604 if you want text updates. And check out the PAL Media Tracker for any of the news and articles that inform this analysis. And that will take me to the end, right on the hour. And that's it. Thank you all so much.
That was incredible. Right on the hour. Yeah, just an additional note that today is actually the deadline for CJ Climate Justice Analysis to receive their EPA funding. So, whatever folks can do to support them in their pressure against the federal government today would really make a difference or mean a lot. As we could maybe find the article, and we may have dropped it in the chat last time around why they have been the subject of this refusal to disperse these funds. Particularly, it is their outspoken stance on Palestine that has brought them this heat. So that's something to note. And yeah, Samara, thanks. I would agree. It's been maybe 10 years since I was on the receiving end of some Sabra hummus, but I do recall that it was not flavorful and likely gross.
Objectively bad.
Objectively bad. So yeah, and so we'll see everyone next week. I do want to note, Samara, that there was multiple requests for us to maybe think about doing a separate deep dive on Syria. So we will take that under consideration and talk to Samara about whether or not something is possible. If not, nothing else, the slides will go out, and if we can distribute anything to you all through email, we will at least do that. But in the remaining weeks of the year, we'll talk and see if we can put together some sort of primer or an event to have people understand the situation, which makes me simultaneously sad that we have another yet front to open up and do a deep dive in, and also grateful and excited that we could provide something useful for people to understand the context and the situation.